Okay, I suspect we'll get a few more folks logging in as folks transition between classes, but we'll go ahead and start. Hello and welcome. I'm so glad that you joined us for our fourth and final seminar in our 2022 Rocky Mountains Cooperative Ecosystem Studies Unit, or CESU Spring Online Series. My name is Lisa Gerloff, and I am the Executive Coordinator for the Rocky Mountains CESU. For those of you in the audience that may not be familiar, the Rocky Mountains CESU is a partnership of federal agencies, universities, and conservation organizations providing research, technical assistance, and education geared towards assisting our federal land and resource agencies in stewardship and management of our resources, our public resources. With over 1,000 projects in our 20+ years of existence, we estimate that 65 to 75% of our projects have had some type of student involvement. That could be supporting graduate or undergraduate research, internships, field schools, or participation in class projects. In 2007, the Rocky Mountains CSU established our Student Awards program as a way to recognize the outstanding work that our students are doing. This year's seminar theme is a celebration of the science and scholarship contributions of those Rocky Mountains CSU Award recipients. In January, we kicked off our series with our two most recent award winners, Scarlett Engel and Jacob Oram. Scarlett, who is working on her PhD at the University of Colorado Boulder, walked us through a culturally appropriate museum redesign of Chapin Mesa and the tribal outreach conducted to create it. And Jacob, who recently finished his master's and is starting a PhD program at Montana State University, demonstrated how statistics is helping in whitebark pine conservation. In February, Jeremy Sultenfuss, restoration ecologist and our 2017 award recipient, joined us. At the time of his award, Jeremy was a PhD student at Colorado State University. He is now a faculty member there with graduate students of his own, some of which are funded through our own CESU mechanism. The title of Jeremy's talk was Co-Creating Knowledge to Inform Restoration and Management in Our National Parks. Our 2016 award recipient, Greg Wan, joined us in March. Greg is another CSU alum and was working on his PhD at the time of his award. Today, Greg is a research ecologist with the USGS Science Center in Fort Collins. In his presentation, Greg shared his research on game bird ecology and conservation issues in the sagebrush and alpine biomes of the West. All of these talks were recorded and are available on our website. And I strongly encourage you to check them out. And I'll put a link to those recordings in the chat box for you shortly. For you, our audience, I want to point out that today's talk will run about 40 minutes and we'll have plenty of time for some questions afterwards. Please notice at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat box and a Q&A box. And I ask you to use the Q&A box to type in your questions as they come up for you. Today, I am so excited to have our 2012 award winner, Nichelle Frank, with us. In 2012, Nichelle was finishing up her master's in history from Colorado State University. She was nominated for her award by Dr. Ruth Alexander of the Public Lands History Center and professor of history at Colorado State, and Herb Meyer, paleontologist at Florissant Fossil Beds National Monument. And the award, her award, was based on her contributions to the CESU project, Oral History Project for Florissant Fossil Beds National Monument. In her award nomination, Dr. Alexander reported, throughout her work on this project, Nichelle Frank demonstrated a thorough commitment to the values and best practices of professional historians working in the public interest. Mr. Meyer, in his letter of support, noted, Nichelle's project added significantly to the oral history collection at Florissant Fossil Beds National Monument. She was able to obtain interviews from several people who had major impacts on the monument. These interviews fill important gaps from the pre-establishment phase of the monument. Her work has great educational value, as visitors are now directly able to hear from the people in their own words how they fought to establish the monument. Now, 10 years later, Dr. Nichelle Frank is an assistant professor of U.S. history at Utah State University Eastern. She studies the effects of the U.S. environmental and historic preservation movements on the cultural landscapes in intermountain mining towns in the 19th century to the present. And I'm happy to turn it over to Nichelle to share more on that topic with us.
Thank you so much, Lisa. That was really nice to think back a little bit for a moment about that oral history project. It was really a fun project to do. It gave me a lot of insight into public history, so it's nice to think about that. Based on that introduction, I'll be talking to you a little bit more about more recent stuff I've been doing. I wanted to start off though, just saying thanks to Lisa for reaching out and getting all of this set up. It was really nice to be invited to do this talk. And also receiving that award way back in the day. It was really a good moment to have as I was finishing up that master's degree at Colorado State and deciding where to go from there. So in doing this presentation today, Lisa asked that I prepare kind of a conference style presentation, and for historians like me, that generally means kind of reading a prepared paper. So I'll be doing a little bit of that today. I wanted to talk a little bit about how I came to the topic that you're seeing here on this screen, this idea of toxic legacies and environmental cleanup in US West mining communities. So for this, I really ended up going on to do my PhD after finishing that master's program. I taught briefly at a community college and then began a PhD program at the University of Oregon. And there I was taking classes in historic preservation and in environmental history. And I really liked both of those things. And so as I was deciding my dissertation topic, I landed on, well, maybe something to do with those, but that's a really broad topic. So narrowing it down, I decided to go with US West mining towns. I have some people in my family background that were miners in the mountains of Colorado. So that's where a little bit of that came from, my interest there. And also I grew up in Colorado, driving in through the mountains, going camping and seeing lots of ghost towns and other small towns that used to be mining towns. So that all piqued my curiosity as I embarked on this particular project. Now that was the dissertation. I'm currently turning that into a book. The book is tentatively titled Dirty, Dark, and Dangerous: Environmental Cleanup and Historic Preservation in US West Mining Communities. It focuses on Butte, Montana, Globe, Arizona, and Leadville, Colorado. So you can see those here. I'd be happy to talk about why those towns, because there were a lot of choices, but I ended up with those three, and I'd be happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. But this book analyzes how, despite frequent friction, historic preservation and environmental efforts from the 1860s to the present shared not just common cause, but common roots. And in fact, both movements tapped into an impulse that has driven many activists, which is cleaning up and creating order. But some of these actions have damaged the historical narrative. Moreover, the physical composition of mining landscapes and their messy past have rendered them unsuitable to such impulses. So cleaning these places up would be very inauthentic to the past. And authenticity is core to preservation, but the cleanup is important to the environmentalists. So here we see the tension. So that tension is what I started to grapple with in my research. Several scholars have looked at this and provide an excellent basis for my own work. Jessica Van Horsen's book, A Town Called Asbestos, Brian Leach's book, The City That Ate Itself, Jillian Klukas' book, Leadville, USA, and a lot of articles, but especially from Frederick Kavik, who is a mining scholar who's argued in favor of preservation of formerly toxic sites. So these scholars examine the moments when various towns across the US and Canada have confronted the toxic legacies of their mining past and present. And then my work is adding into a lot of that, this battle between historic preservation and environmentalists. As a graduate student taking historic preservation and environmental history courses, I couldn't help but notice that activists in both fields really had a lot in common. They each wanted to save landscapes in some way. They each witnessed waves of activism around the same time periods. They each became codified in federal law during the 1960s and 70s. But despite all these similarities and more, I noticed they did not seem to work together, not very often at least. So that was interesting. But also they often butted heads, particularly in these deindustrialized locations like mining towns. For instance, some preservationists sought to save remnants of the industrial landscape, while environmentalists argued that doing so posed continuing health problems for residents, visitors, wildlife, and local ecosystems. And as I was studying this, I thought, is there really no way to accomplish both? And after reading into it more, I did find some scholars talking about this a little bit and saying, yeah, there may be some ways to accomplish both of these things. And I was curious how that had developed historically in these places. So that's what the book has ended up being. It's the first book-length study that weaves together the historic preservation and environmentalist aspect. And in doing so, it spotlights the commonalities between the two and hopefully will foster improvements in managing historic mining landscapes that really matter to everyone in the West and beyond. To accomplish this, my book's argument fleshes out an aspect of the dissertation that was just barely articulated, which was a discussion about how various people, maybe kind of like you're seeing gathered here at a meeting in Leadville in 2008, when they get together and they are deciding what to do in these mining communities, that they're often debating each other. And what was the source of that debate? And from what I've found, a lot of this has been because they couldn't agree on whose knowledge counted as expert knowledge. Moreover, whichever knowledge counted as expert held the potential for gaining the most legal, political, and economic power, therefore becoming the knowledge used in actually deciding which historic preservation and environmental actions to take. So today I'd like to explore one of the book's main questions: how have residents, scientists, and other stakeholders shaped these townscapes to address concerns about health while also preserving remnants of the town's industrial past? Although my book adds the historic preservation aspect to that question and uses all three towns to explore these issues, I'm just going to focus on the environmental aspect today and just on Leadville and Globe. But I'd be happy to talk about the preservation aspect as well as Butte during the Q&A. A quick note on terms. So throughout this talk, I'll be mentioning the EPA. So Environmental Protection Agency, established under the Nixon administration in 1970. I'll also be referring to the EPA's Superfund program, and I always try to articulate that as hard as I can. For people who don't know, I'm not saying super fun like hooray, this is super fun, but super fund as in this is going to require a lot of money. So this is the nickname for the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act from 1980. The Superfund program involves the EPA sending officials, scientists, et cetera, out to study and identify toxic sites around the nation. So you can see an early map from about the 1980s, early 80s, showing some of those initial sites that were identified. And so these are considered so contaminated that local and state governments do not have personnel or funding in order to clean them up. It originally was funded via taxes on the petroleum and chemical industries, but that ended in the 1990s. Today, it's funded typically through taxpayers. If, though, the EPA can identify somebody, maybe an organization, a company, who was personally responsible, as they put it, for the contamination, they'll demand that that company, organization, or whoever pay for at least part of the cost of cleanup. So those are some overarching things, but I would like to start with the case of Globe, Arizona. So in the case of Globe, you can see here, Globe is a couple hours east of Phoenix, and then that inset map also shows you a little bit more about Globe's surroundings. It's often referred to as Globe, Miami, because that next town over, Miami, is right there. And Miami is where some current copper mining is still ongoing, which you can see here on this satellite shot, showing some of the large open pit mines that are out there these days. But in the case of Globe, Arizona, the town's historical link to asbestos mining and milling in particular proved a flashpoint for the EPA during its early years cleaning up mining towns. Globe had historically been known for its copper mining, which still continues in that open pit area outside of Miami. But throughout much of the 1950s and 60s, 3 asbestos mills occupied an area on the eastern outskirts of Globe, including one that I will focus on today, known as Matate. So here you can see a map showing where some of those asbestos mills were located in Globe itself. They're on the streets, but way down towards the bottom right of this image, where I just put a little turquoise square, those are these other 3 on the outskirts of town that I'll be talking about. So asbestos in Arizona was particularly desirable because of its long fibers. So you can see that in many of these mills, they were set up to process those long fibers. And this is the Matate Mill, one of those that you could see on that map. But this is the kind of asbestos that they were milling, chrysotile asbestos. So manufacturers would spin this, press it, mix it, otherwise process it into fireproof exterior wall sheathing, electrical insulation, and cement sewer pipes. But during World War II and through the 1960s, Globe's asbestos provided the federal government with a steady source of the material. When the US government's demand for asbestos, which had been really dependent on war industry, declined in the 1960s, the government ends up stopping their purchasing of asbestos from Globe producers. The local mine and mill owners then were scrambling for their livelihoods. Just at the time that these mill owners lost one of their most profitable clients, knowledge about asbestos's potential harm to human health had spread, and regulation of asbestos grew. Scientists in the early 20th century linked asbestos exposure to human health problems, and their knowledge developed rapidly during the early 20th century. As they continued discovering cases that linked asbestos to human health problems, their knowledge spread to the public through publication in widely consulted sources, such as the Encyclopedia Britannica. By 1970, there were some attempts to regulate workers' exposure to asbestos, but not until the 1970 passage of the Occupational Health and Safety Act did asbestos regulation solidify. With OSHA, companies had to monitor the amount of asbestos their workers might be exposed to and ensure that it did not cross a certain threshold. These federal laws inspired local governments to pass their own air quality control measures. When the Matate Mill failed to meet air quality standards for the Pinal-Gila County's Air Quality Control District in 1973, it closed. The Jackways Mill, right next door, continued to operate. After his mill's closure, Matate's owner, Jack Neal, quickly generated a new way to profit from his property: sell it off as lots for mobile homes. Pinal-Gila County's Air Quality Control District Director, Elsie Kopsich, wrote to Globe Mayor Eugene Rabagliati saying that he had heard of Neal's idea to turn Matate's mill site into mobile home lots, despite the fact that the site bordered the still operating Jackways Mill. I'm not sure, Kopsich warned, that you are aware of the possible health hazards involved in allowing residences to be built in close proximity to an operating asbestos mill. He then detailed the EPA's recent declaration of asbestos as a hazardous air pollutant. Both Jackways and Matate had been working with Pinal-Gila AQCD, but even with their compliance, there were fine particles escaping into the atmosphere. The AQCD had allowed the mills to continue operating because of their remoteness from residential areas. But with Neal's subdivision, homes would easily be right there, right next to the still operating mill and right on top of the former Matate Mill. Despite Kopsich's warning, the city approved Neal's plan, and after leveling the property and topping it with soil, Neal began selling lots for a mobile home community he called Mountain View Mobile Home Estates. In 1974, more than 100 people moved in. In fall of 1979, so 4 years later, state and local health officials had been conducting routine checks of wastewater in the area when they identified the nearby asbestos as a health risk. The Assistant Surgeon General of the United States recommended immediate evacuation. And on January 17th, 1980, Arizona Governor Bruce Babbitt declared the situation an emergency. Some Globe residents resented all of this. Globe Chamber of Commerce manager Donna Anderson wrote several articles in the local news decrying the officials' claims that asbestos was dangerous enough to warrant the emergency. Frequently, she cited bodily experience as evidence for why the state's actions were unwarranted. She claimed too many people have lived with it and played in it all their lives and are completely healthy, perfectly healthy. I just don't believe that it's dangerous. So far as I know, they have not found any deaths in this area from asbestos-related causes. So she simply did not see sufficient evidence to convince her that asbestos was any cause for concern. The people who actually lived in Mountain View were very split over the issue. I know this is a little bit blurry, but of the 40 families in the mobile homes, 26 agreed to leave right away. 16 families wanted to stay until cleanup began. 4 families refused to leave under any circumstances. As the debate raged, the federal government offered Mountain View residents emergency housing while state officials spread 6 inches of soil over the subdivision and swept the streets clean. After the cleanup finished, residents were allowed to return. Despite cleanup being complete, some Globe residents could not let this debate go, and they started to unearth evidence to support their position that asbestos was not harmful. According to research by local residents Mike Wood and Alvin Gerhardt, chrysotile asbestos was not a health threat. So chrysotile asbestos is one of 6 forms of asbestos, some of which Wood and Gerhardt recognized as being potentially deadly, but chrysotile, they said, was not based on their research. So Wood, a former insurance agent, and Gerhardt, a former mining industry executive claimed, much like Donna Anderson had, that they had never known anyone to get sick from asbestos. Neither of the two men lived in Mountain View mobile home estates. In an attempt to provide evidence to challenge official data, the two men conducted 150 interviews in 1982 to accumulate what they said was factual information on the effect of chrysotile asbestos on the people's health. They asked about occupation, frequency and length of exposure to asbestos, signs of illness, smoking habits, and exposure to secondhand smoke, among other things. Many interview subjects reported having lived in Globe since at least the 1950s, and many had worked for Jackways or Matate. Each had been exposed to asbestos for months, even years. None of them reported any asbestos-related illnesses in themselves or their immediate family members. As Wood and Gerhart compiled their data, the 6 inches of soil that the state had applied in the Mountain View area was eroding, and nearby residents noticed asbestos fibers sticking out of the ground. By December 1982, the Environmental Protection Agency listed Mountain View on its national priorities list. The EPA determined that the most cost-effective cleanup method was to demolish the mills and mobile homes, lay down a thick filter paper topped by 21 inches of soil and 3 inches of crushed rock, then surround the area with a chain link fence and monitor it in perpetuity. Additionally, the EPA recommended the permanent relocation of residents. As the law requires, the EPA presented its solution to the community and invited public comment. More than 125 people attended the May 1983 meeting. Wood and Gerhart offered the most vocal objections, but 30 other members of the public submitted letters or made statements. Of those, 14 supported permanent relocation of Mountain View residents, and 8 believed that chrysotile asbestos was not hazardous and that remedial action or further study were unnecessary. None of those listed as opponents of remediation lived at the mobile home community. Of the 14 who supported cleanup and relocation, 9 lived or owned property at Mountain View and 4 were health and government officials. Thus, of those who submitted letters or made statements, all of them who were from the Mountain View area supported cleanup. In other words, opposition came from non-residents. In fact, Mountain View residents testified before a Senate subcommittee in Washington, D.C. in 1984 that there were ongoing health problems in their community. Mountain View resident John Insulaco, for instance, described how there are a lot of sick people in Mountain View. Another resident, who you see pictured here, Catherine Scott, was a lab technician for the assay office of a local mining organization. And she reported, since we moved back, my daughter Stacy has had numerous medical problems. Previous to our moving to Mountain View, she was a healthy girl. It makes me wonder if these illnesses are a result of her exposure there. So according to these experiences, asbestos did have an impact on physical health in Globe. Moreover, several residents commented that the abuse from other Globe residents, combined with the knowledge that they might be living in a contaminated area, had traumatized them, thereby creating a psychological health impact on top of the physical health problems some of them were experiencing. Despite this, some Globe residents continued to argue that asbestos was not a health threat, and in fact, cleaning up the area would threaten the local economy. In a 1984 letter to Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater, Wood and Gerhart described how the EPA was pressuring Jackways to destroy a 26,000-ton tailings pile. If this destruction is completed, they said, it will permanently close down the mining, milling, and the whole chrysotile asbestos industry in Gila County. The closing of the mill would result in another $2 million loss, the present day cost to replace it. In this case, economic health foregrounded their argument since they believed that the bodily health effects didn't exist. while opponents continued arguing that there had been no known cases of asbestos-related disease in the community and that the EPA action would harm business, the EPA presented its own logic and evidence. The EPA is aware, Assistant Administrator Lee Thomas explained in 1984, of the globe business community's concern that the economy and reputation of the area not suffer as a result of association with Mountain View Estates. He also reiterated why the bodily health effects were worth considering. Quote, "We have been advised by medical experts of the CDC that statistically it would be unlikely that exposure and effect relationships could be demonstrated in a populated area as small as Globe. However, the relative statistical significance of the population does not change the evidence that chrysotile asbestos is a human carcinogen, which poses an unacceptable threat to the residents of Mountain View subdivision." Nonetheless, Globe's Chamber of Commerce President Robert Zaki, who had written Lee Thomas a letter previously, argued that people who had been hardly exposed have had no ill effects from this exposure. So he responded to Lee Thomas in mid-1985. In that letter, he was lamenting Globe's loss of a small industry, and instead it's gaining for being the most hazardous city in the state. Perhaps Zaki might have been more convinced had Thomas emphasized how the effects of asbestos exposure take years to manifest, and therefore might explain the absence of cases up to 1984. Instead, Zaki trusted his body and his experience in the local environment over the EPA's knowledge gathered from studies in other locations. Differences of opinion also existed within the federal government. For instance, there was Dr. Malcolm C. Ross, a research mineralogist for the U.S. Geological Survey. Ross had been speaking about the situation in Globe since at least the very first scare in 1980. At that stage, he said, "I don't think there is any need for alarm at all for any of the residents of Globe," and that he was very much disturbed by the anxiety that is ensuing. Ross's beliefs about asbestos stemmed from studies conducted at the Thetford chrysotile asbestos mines in Canada. According to Ross's accounting of those studies, scientists had found 9 cases of mesothelioma in 11,000 miners. By 1984, Ross reiterated his beliefs in presentations to the White House, Congress, and federal agencies. Ross viewed asbestos as a spectrum of types, some of which were extremely harmful to humans. For one type, however, he maintained there was little evidence to support claims of its deadliness: chrysotile. Ross's opinions, however, were unpopular with other government officials of the time. The Centers for Disease Control doubted Ross's data, attacking him for statistical manipulations that were highly inappropriate. The CDC also noted that Ross failed to consider how long it had been since victims were exposed to asbestos, an important factor in latent diseases such as cancer. The EPA and the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health agreed with the CDC. Moreover, some officials questioned Ross's qualifications for weighing in on health issues, since his expertise was in geology, not health or medicine. For example, Representative George Miller hoped the government, quote, would not allow the opinions of an individual with no background in public health to influence policy in this area. According to such notions, geological expertise had no place in public health policy. Despite all of the debate, the EPA went ahead with cleanup, which it completed by 1985. So here you can see on the left an older image showing the Mountain View mobile homes, and then on the right, a more recent satellite view showing that area as empty. In fact, the EPA never bought the arguments that chrysotile asbestos did not harm humans. Instead, in 1989, the agency implemented the asbestos ban and phase out rule, which banned asbestos production indiscriminate of type. By 1991, a court case overturned the EPA's all-out ban and instead limited the ban to preventing the production of asbestos in the US. or using specific asbestos products obtained from other countries. The EPA and the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality still monitor Mountain View. Chrysotile asbestos is currently still on the EPA's list of hazardous substances. Like Globe, Leadville by the 1980s was no longer the thriving mining town it once had been. And town leaders believed that tourism might offer sustenance to the community. Leadville had lost most of its ongoing mining, and the major mining at Climax molybdenum mine northeast of town was struggling. So here, this satellite view, you can see Leadville way down there on the bottom left, and then up towards the upper right, that's where you can see Climax molybdenum mine. Events in Leadville contrasted with those in Globe, however, because many local residents felt that the tailings piles, slag heaps, decaying mining buildings evoked a sense of the town's mining past. Perhaps, they thought, such authentic pieces of the mining past could attract tourists. Anything that would threaten to change or remove those remnants then, perhaps environmental cleanup, would be a threat to their renewed efforts at developing their tourist industry. Although modern learners might immediately question the health of a place called Leadville, up until the 1970s, lead was not quite the major health concern that it is today. Although lead's ability to poison humans was well known since ancient times, most people understood such poisoning to result from exposure to high doses of lead. Despite the town's name, it wasn't the lead that first brought the EPA to Leadville, but problems with acidic mine water. But amid a national awakening about the dangers of low-dose lead poisoning in the 1980s, the EPA grew concerned about the levels of lead in Leadville's soil as well. Why the EPA was concerned about lead in the soil and not just hanging out in the ore in the area or something like that was because of Leadville's mining past. Several smelters once operated along the southern edge of town, including the Arkansas Valley and the American mining smelters next to a part of Leadville called Stringtown. The smelting process produces large clouds of smoke containing particulates of arsenic, lead, and bismuth, all elements that can be dangerous to humans and animals. Leadville is in a valley, and when that smoke was floating around, it just concentrated in the valley so that the arsenic, lead, and bismuth particulates settled over houses, yards, and streets. Those living closest to the Arkansas Valley smelter, like you're seeing here, which were namely immigrant and racial minority workers, bore the brunt of a lot of that smoke and dust. Tiny particulates settled into the soil such that their presence remained well after the smelters closed in the 1960s. Scientists and government officials had debated the links between health problems and smelter smoke since at least the early 20th century. By the 1980s, the general public was well aware of the acute health problems associated with exposure to lead, which would have been in that smoke, including things like drowsiness, irritability, or even paralysis and coma. A study conducted by Dr. Herbert Needleman in 1979 revealed a correlation between elevated levels of lead in blood with learning disabilities in children. His study achieved nationwide publicity, prompting people to worry about symptoms of lead poisoning that were harder to see, less severe, and a result of lower levels of exposure. So back in Leadville, with financial support from the EPA, the Colorado State Health Department led a study of Leadville soils in 1987 and published the results 3 years later. The study reported that 41% of Leadville's children aged 6 or less had lead levels exceeding CDC standards, and that there was evidence that children who played outdoors had elevated levels of lead. The study recommended lowering the exposure, as well as covering lead-laced areas with grass, minimizing the opportunities for children to consume anything that could contain lead, and leaving mine tools and clothing at the mines. For residents living in the southern and eastern sides of town, this would mean keeping their children from playing in their very own yards. Coinciding with this study was the ongoing presence of a mining company, American Smelting and Refining Company, or ASARCO. Although the 1987 study through the state health department didn't make any sort of recommendations regarding ASARCO's role, it could have been used as evidence for the EPA to pursue extensive cleanup and to hold ASARCO liable, since the study pointed to a significant health risk associated with ASARCO property. But ASARCO officials balked at the data. They were so incensed that they obtained a court order to prevent the EPA from discussing figures from the 1987 study and funded a follow-up study in 1994. According to the corporate study, 8% of the children had blood lead levels of more than 10 micrograms per deciliter. This is the CDC threshold. They also noticed that in some parts of town where families were more exposed to those higher levels. With both studies suggesting that there was some degree of contamination, the EPA began cleanup. Cue the local response. Local community leaders and some other residents denied health risks associated with lead. Many of these locals based their opinions on the fact that they had never personally seen evidence of lead-related illnesses. Here in Leadville, we really don't believe the lead affects our kids, explained Kathy Brenza. You can see her quote here, a mother, director of the center, a school for as many as 700 children. Although she had noticed kids struggling with learning, she attributed it to poverty and parental influences rather than lead. I guess what I and many townspeople recognized was something that then mayor and third generation miner Jim Martin said, is that you don't see any two-headed kids or idiots. Another former miner, Stephen Voynick, noted, I've talked to old timers who say they have played in mine tailings ponds and they're 75 years old. They think as long as you don't eat the stuff or drink water coming out of the Yak, which was an old mining tunnel, nothing is going to happen to you. Even local health officials questioned how worried locals should be. Charlene Smith of the Lake County Health Department commented, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that lead isn't dangerous, but let's use some common sense here. A good case of measles can make you deaf or blind or retarded, and I'm certainly more concerned about that than I am about the lead in the dirt around here. For her, common sense, knowledge, meant recognizing the danger and taking appropriate precautions, but not going overboard, as she believed the EPA's plan to clean up soils would be. The EPA realized that residents felt this way, but pushed back. It's particularly hard to change people's minds with something like lead, said Bob Dupree, EPA Regional Director of Hazardous Waste. He reasoned, because we don't expect people to be acutely ill. We're more concerned with chronic effects. Those aren't things that are going to be obvious. Other EPA officials agreed. Lead poisoning is insidious, one said. You can't see it, so you can't say to a family, your kid's IQ might be 10 points higher without exposure to lead. EPA regional toxicologist Christopher Weiss had noted that the locals' pushback had been particularly strong after the EPA had changed its focus, quote, from a watershed problem to a human health problem. It was not that the EPA said only that mining had poisoned the environment, but also that it had poisoned the bodies of residents. Since much of the national conversation about lead poisoning pointed to lower IQ levels as a primary symptom, the EPA's push to say that lead poisoning existed in Leadville's children also read as a personal insult to some residents. Residents also distrusted the EPA because agency officials miscommunicated and sometimes merely didn't listen to the residents. Many residents were educated, well-informed people, including professional engineers, geologists, and hydrologists. Peter Mahler, a professor of environmental technology, believed the EPA had consistently ignored local expertise and should have adopted a more site-specific approach. Another professor of environmental technology, Peter Jeff Fofnig, scoffed that the EPA personnel who hold public meetings sometimes, quote, seem unable to distinguish between an informed, experienced person expressing an expert opinion and a crackpot who makes an emotional, irrational statement. Indeed, since about 1988, a major point of controversy was the EPA's plan to plug the Yak Tunnel. So you can see that in this green line here. It occupies a part of the landscape outside of town. It's been a prominent tunnel, prominent point of conversation for much of the environmental questions. Locals argued that plugging the tunnel might cause mine water to migrate and contaminate the city's water supply. By 1991, after 3 years of study, the EPA concluded that the locals had been correct. As president of the Lake County Environmental Task Force noted about instances like these, quote, "These are people here with decades of experience who know you can't know the area. When someone says after 2 months that they do, there goes their credibility." So the EPA had refused to listen to local experts and instead spent valuable time and dollars on a study that came to the same conclusion locals had already identified. For many residents, it was further evidence that EPA officials were not trustworthy and simply wasting resources. Needless to say, the government's attention to lead in the soil eventually prompted the 1994 Kids First program to clean up lead in Leadville soils. ASARCO funded the program because Superfund litigation charged the company with residential cleanup. Kids First gave residents a choice. In earlier efforts to study and address the soil problems, EPA officials had run into what they believed was a, quote, Western attitude about private property. As they put it, "It's my property, leave it alone, I can do with it what I want." ASARCO's Kids First program encouraged Leadvilleites to exercise their private property rights by choosing whether or not to have their property and their blood tested. It received approval from the EPA, and by 2002, 550 children had received blood tests. The results revealed that children living in historically marginalized areas of town had higher blood lead levels than those living near the historically wealthier and Euro-American areas. But also by 2002, yards at 120 homes had been removed or capped. Lead levels in the blood, in general, decreased accordingly. This more voluntary effort seemed to have some success. The debates and cleanup are ongoing in Leadville today as EPA officials continue grappling with the complexity of Leadville's contamination. So you can see here up in the hills outside of Leadville on the left, some of the tailings that are still around, some of those fallen structures that are around. On the right, you can see what they call the Merlot ponds. So it's a pond of water that's gone through that kind of acidic mine water process so that it turns very dark red. Now, Globe and Leadville are just two examples of the complex debates in mining towns over which form of knowledge is most valid. The resulting solutions have been imperfect, perhaps even destructive, but they have taught important lessons. For one, these towns are suffering. Everyone agrees on that part. But everyone does not agree about which cause of the suffering is the true cause. And that disagreement teaches a second lesson. Neither the EPA's knowledge nor the locals' knowledge alone have been sufficient in addressing concerns about health and history. One of the unfortunate things about these environmental projects is the amount of time and money they are taking, two things in this world that people value quite greatly. But with these mining communities, the issues can be complex. And although the symptoms of a larger issue in the community might appear obvious to some, the actual illness is more complicated. And as with many illnesses, diagnosis begins with ruling out the most common problems and progresses to trying out various treatments when the cause is not entirely clear. It takes time and it takes money. To further aggravate the process, in mining towns, the problems vary and change over time, just as knowledge about health and history do. So the solutions must change over time as well. While these lessons might be read as reason to see only challenges, and perhaps even insurmountable ones at that, I wonder if the challenges are the reason to hope for outcomes that more strongly recognize the value of combining various forms of knowledge. In fact, if the examples I just gave are any indication, all of this heartache in ruling out potential causes is actually pulling these towns closer to solutions. The heart of the tension in these towns has not been that various stakeholders don't have ideas about moving forward, probably far from it, but that they have disagreed on the most pressing need in each community, the current economic crisis or pernicious disease. The story of Globe tells us that environmental cleanup can be swift and perhaps conclusive, but leads to a loss of a key moment in the historical narrative if conducted in such a wholesale manner. The story of Leadville tells us that cleanup can also be lengthy and inconclusive, but in doing so, has at least sometimes led to a stronger effort to combine cleanup with preserving a sense of place. And that sense of place is really what unites the causes of both those seeking to preserve the past and those seeking to save the environment. Focusing on that common cause might just be why there's hope for these towns. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you, Nichelle. That was fascinating. We have about 5 minutes left, so I want to open it up to questions from our audience. Again, please use, if you have a question, please use the Q&A box to type your questions in, and we'll get to them. So while giving folks an opportunity to do that, I'll start off with a question. I'm just kind of curious, you know, in your Leadville example, it seems like cleanup was on a volunteer basis. And going back to the Globe example, there was the statement that a certain number of residents in the mobile home park would not leave at under any circumstances, but you showed the photos of, okay, all the mobile homes are gone. Were those people that were reluctant convinced, and did they leave voluntarily, or were they forced somehow? Do you know?
That's such a great question. And unfortunately, I don't know. It's been very difficult to identify the people in that community and which ones believed which thing, unless they were identified in newspaper articles or that subcommittee hearing. That's the only evidence I've ever been able to find, but I keep digging because actually that story, the Globe story, was one that I encountered in the archives kind of towards the end of writing my dissertation. And so I have just tons of copies of documents where I'm still reading through and learning more. So maybe somewhere buried in those documents, there's something about that, but unfortunately, I'm not sure what ended up with those 4 families in particular. It's a great question though.
Here's an obvious question. When will your book be available, and can we pre-order?
Oh, wow. What a wonderful question. Gosh, it'll probably still be, I don't even know, probably a couple of years still. So someday, but it's still in the works. Yeah.
All right. We'll keep in touch. Yeah. So we can get that information out. Any big differences from the two examples you gave, Globe and Leadville, with your the Butte story that you would want to share quickly?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, we can go on and on about Butte. Butte is one where you can see that picture there on the left of the screen. That's the Berkeley pit in Butte. So they transitioned to open pit mining in the when was that? 1970s or so, when they started really doing a lot of that. And it ended up eating up, as Brian Leach's title of his book says, The City That Ate Itself, eating up part of the historic structure of the town, like old neighborhoods and things like that. Because they have that Berkeley pit, it is a prominent feature of the landscape, and there's not really a great way to hide it, which is very different from something like in Globe, where they've buried that site and they just, you don't really know it's there. I mean, you can see that picture there on the right. That's where it was, and that's right off the highway. If you didn't know it was there, you'd probably miss it. But Butte doesn't have that option. That is a very giant hole. So they've turned that into a tourist attraction. You can go and pay, like, I can't even remember. It used to be $2 to go look from the little viewing platform that they have. You go through a little tunnel and see that water there. So that's been a huge difference, is the way that they've approached it. Also, there's been a lot more attention in Butte from many of the historic preservationists there to that whole, how can we preserve remnants of the mining landscape? Are there ways to make sure it's not toxic, but also still looks like a mining landscape? You still can look at the hill off on the north side of town and just be like, yeah, that's definitely mining, but it's not going to pose any sort of danger. So that would be one prominent example I would give. Yeah. Okay. There are a lot though.
I want to be mindful of people's time. It is 3 o'clock. So if you need to pop off, thank you for joining us. One more question did pop up. So Nichelle, if you're willing to stay on for a couple more minutes, I'll go ahead and ask it.
Yeah, for sure.
Have you considered what changes we need in policy to prevent scientists from having to prove a negative, i.e. harm to human and environmental health?
Ooh, I really like the phrasing of that question. I'll have to take note of it because I like the phrasing there. Part of this project, when I started the project, I really did have the idea of, I hope this could be useful to people who are the policymakers. Me not having a lot of that training and background and all of that, I've been hesitant myself to make policy recommendations, but that is my hope with this project, with the book, with maybe giving talks, public talks and things like that, connecting with people who are the policymakers so that they can move forward using these examples to help them understand all the various ways that these things have turned out and what hasn't worked. And then there are some instances where things have worked out okay, if not great. So that's a great question. And hopefully, yeah, there may be some development, but I don't personally have a whole lot of recommendations right off the top of my head here.
Okay. Again, mindful of people's time. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, Nichelle, for ending our seminar series with a bang. A very interesting topic. And yeah, we could talk about this probably for a couple hours, but we have to end up at some point. This presentation is being recorded and will be shared on our Rocky Mountain CSU website by early next week, and we will share that that link with all of you when it's ready. So again, thank you to our audience and thank you to Nichelle, and we'll see you next spring for our 2023 online seminar series.
Thank you.